Hey everyone, this is Ben Norton. You are watching or listening to Moderate Rebels. Today we are talking about Chile. There were presidential elections this week in Chile, and the far-right candidate, José Antonio Kast, lost. This is important because Kast represented the legacy of Pinochet, the US-backed right-wing dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, which came to power in 1973 through the famous 9/11 coup in 1973, in which the CIA overthrew Chile's democratically elected president of Salvador Allende, a socialist who won fair and free elections and was overthrown and led to a period of a brutal right-wing dictatorship under Pinochet. So the fact is that in this election, Kast really was the symbol of Pinochet, defending his legacy, calling for a return to many of those same kind of hyper-capitalist neoliberal policies. On the other side, in the second round of the election, was a 35-year-old social democrat, center-left, named Gabriel Boric. We'll talk about him. He's not a great candidate, and there's a lot to criticize. But at the same time, the fact that he won, I think, is a very important symbol of Chile rejecting the legacy of Pinochet and doing so in a resounding victory. We should keep in mind that the results were 56% for Boric and 44% for Kast. So that's a 12% margin. That's a pretty sizable victory. Max has joined us here. We're also joined by Pablo Vivanco. He is a journalist, a Chilean-born journalist, currently in Canada, and has worked with Telesur and other outlets. He's also a filmmaker and has done great work. So today we're going to reflect on the results, what it means for Chile. We're also going to talk about it in the context of the massive social uprising that happened 2 years ago against the kind of neoliberal policies that were represented by Kast. And we're going to talk about the Indigenous Mapuche community, which has been protesting against the central government. We'll talk about the role of natural resources in Chile, which are important. Chile has some of the largest copper reserves in the world. It also has very significant lithium reserves. So if we're talking about a Green New Deal, a move toward renewable energy, Chile, like Bolivia, is going to play an important role. Its natural resources are going to play an important role. So, Pablo, let's begin. I gave a brief overview there of the two main candidates in this election. There was a first round of the presidential election in which there were other candidates. Later, we can talk about Daniel Jadue, who was the candidate from the Communist Party of Chile. He was, for a lot of people on the left, especially for anti-imperialists, Jadue was certainly a much more preferable candidate over Gabriel Boric. But Jadue was not the candidate in the end because ultimately there was an open primary, which we can talk about, in which anyone could vote. And Boric ended up winning that primary, which made Boric the candidate against Kast. So we'll talk about that in a bit. But I think what we can do is just kind of start generally. Maybe you can give your analysis. What do you think about this election and what is the significance in Chile?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, it is very significant. These are not elections. These elections weren't like any of the elections that we've seen in Chile since the return to civilian government in the early 90s. It was significantly more polarized, and both candidates, while I don't disagree with your characterization of Boric, I've seen some outlets refer to him as a socialist. I personally wouldn't, kind of characterize him like that. I'm not sure if he would characterize himself like that. It certainly more to the left on a number of issues than any of the previous left candidates from the Concertación or from the Nueva Mayoría, which was, the Concertación was the coalition of parties, the Socialist Party, the Christian Democrats, the Radicals, a smattering of others, Party for Democracy, that governed for the majority of 1990 to about 2012. They ran successive sort of candidates. Them having their own processes to determine who would be the presidential candidate for that coalition. And then we obviously have 2 periods since then where Sebastián Piñera, the candidate for the right wing coalition, has won 2 times, not successively, because that's not allowed in Chilean politics, but he has won twice. Kast, José Antonio Kast, was significantly to the right of Piñera, and Boric significantly, I would say, significantly to the left of any of the candidates that have previously presented, have gone to the second round for the, if not the left, then the opposite of the right. So I do think it's significant. It is something that is a culmination of the protest that you talked about, which I'm sure we'll get into. Something that I'm not sure if it would have been, if you would have seen this, if this would have been possible, if it wouldn't have been for those protests that began in October 2019. At the same time, we shouldn't ignore the fact, as much as Kast losing significantly, and a lot losing by a much larger margin than was projected by the polls. I mean, it's still 45% of folks voting for a very reactionary candidate, right? Like, I mean, he's certainly running on the same sort of neoliberal pro-business platforms as the previous right-wing candidates, but also, like you said, somebody with a long history connected with the most reactionary elements of Pinochetismo, somebody with an actual Nazi background, since his father was a member of the Nazi Party, something which he tried to deny, but then actually came out and had to be recognized. And someone who, in terms of his own policies, was advocating things which a lot of right-wing candidates had tried to distance themselves from. For example, specifically putting on the program that they wanted to coordinate with regional governments to identify and target, arrest, and who knows what else, left-wing candidates in the region, something which kind of harkens back to the memory of Plan Condor. So Kast represented something which hadn't been seen really in Chilean politics since the dictatorship. Boric, we can kind of get into some of the things that he represents, and some of the things where he's where people on the left, including myself, are critical and remain critical. But it is significant and hopefully a signal of some of the things that will come in the next year, because there's going to be some very significant things that happen after this election.
Yeah, Max, do you want to jump in? Max, you're muted. Well, Max, there we go.
There was an issue with the preamp, so I was saying hi to Pablo. Nice to, I think we might have met before
in Venezuela.
In Venezuela. Well, good to see you again remotely.
Yeah.
Next year in the liberated South American continent. Although this discussion might go in a direction that applies some pessimism to that vision. We're realists, we're moderate realists, but I guess I want to, before we talk about Boric and get into his background, maybe you could give us kind of an overview of Chilean politics, because obviously, as you said, this election was very different. It reminds me a little bit of the US electorate and how it's become so polarized that if there were to be a natural US election and both parties were to embrace their natural constituencies, you would consistently see a figure like Donald Trump, not Mitt Romney, who's our version, like the Mormon version of Piñera. And you would see either not necessarily a Bernie Sanders figure, but more like a kind of woke AOC person, maybe with slightly more moderate presentation. But Chilean politics seems to have developed in a more natural way. Maybe I'm wrong here, but it seems like the electorate has become more polarized than ever before, or than since the Pinochet era. Maybe you can lay it out.
Yeah, so I think it's natural for and I've seen a lot of folks on the left trying to situate Boric in terms of other folks which are recognizable, and I do see some similarities with Boric and like a AOC, for example, or Pablo Iglesias, if you want to look at an example from Europe in terms of part of a newer version of the left with some postmodernist sort of tendencies, a focus on sort of identity issues, certain things like that. Perhaps not just like I guess more sort of the classical class-based politics that have identified Latin American leftists for a long time. That said, Chilean politics itself are quite different from the U.S. or I would even say like Spain, if we want to kind of carry on to that piece. As much as the dictatorship was brutal and strived to completely eradicate the left, it was never able to. The left in Chile, the organized left, including and perhaps especially the Communist Party, have remained important figures in mass movements. And the social movements as a whole, even trade unions, even though their rights during the dictatorship were completely eliminated, and thereafter have only kind of incrementally they're allowed to exist, but they don't really kind of have any sort of the power that for bargaining even for their members that you would see in the US or Canada and other places in Europe. So the organized left is still very prominent and present. And this is where, although we can talk about the connection of Boric to the 2009 2019 demonstrations and protests that went on for months, there was a period of at least 15 years or 14 years before that where every year there was huge mass movements in Chile. This is kind of where some of the things that begat not only Boric, who was a former student leader. He led the National Student Federation after Camila Vallejo, who was kind of rose to prominence internationally because she was a young communist leader as well, and I guess she was very photogenic. So she got some prominence there for a while. There was years of not only mass student demonstrations, but then also every year you'd see hundreds of thousands of people on the street around either labor issues, environmental issues, pensions, whatever. And this was an annual thing, right? That happened every year. So it's not like Boric kind of came out of nowhere and was just a singular figure. And in fact, I think there's a lot to suggest in these elections that people didn't vote for Boric, again, in these significant numbers because of him, right? They voted almost in spite of him, right? And I think if you compare the results of the first round and analyze the dynamics in terms of what happened in the second round, you see some of those things play out.
Yeah, and let's talk about the 2019 protests, because I think we can't really understand the rise of Boric without that. Boric himself was first well known because he was involved in student protests a decade ago against neoliberal policies, a rise in tuition. And you mentioned student leaders like Boric, also Camila Vallejo and others who rose to prominence. And at that time, Boric was part of kind of anarchist circles. They call themselves autonomists, but they call themselves libertarian socialists, like the kind of anarchisty circles that are anti-communist and will criticize Venezuela and Nicaragua and Cuba and China and Vietnam and revolutionary left movements in history, but still have this kind of left-wing identity. And we saw a series of those leaders. Some of them moved further right. Some of them became senators. Some of them became congresspeople. Boric himself became a member of Congress and was involved in these kind of autonomous left parties. And then this brings us to 2019, in which there was this massive social uprising, which began again in protest of these neoliberal policies imposed this time by the Piñera government. Sebastián Piñera is a billionaire himself. He also has a legacy of kind of softly defending Pinochet, not to the same degree as Kast, who pretty openly defended Pinochet, but also We saw that Piñera, for instance, opposed the extradition of Pinochet and said we have to defend Pinochet in a speech. So he's not. He is definitely slightly more moderate than Kast, who's a far right figure, but Piñera himself is a pretty right wing oligarch figure, and he was cutting public transportation funding and increasing public transportation costs, and this led to this massive uprising in 2019. So, to me, it seems that we can't understand Boric's victory without understanding those protests and then the process of rewriting the constitution. Chile, a lot of people don't know this, Chile still has the same constitution that was written in the Pinochet era. So this is still a deeply, systemically, a neoliberal constitution in which privatization is written in to the very structure of the government. And like you said, I mean, a lot of people, I think, are mistakenly trying to make this victory all about Boric. But to me, it seems like the most important thing about this electoral victory is not Boric as a person, but rather the fact that the Chilean people gave a democratic mandate to this person who represents the protest of 2019 and who represents the Constitutional Convention to rewrite the Pinochet-era constitution.
Yeah, and you know what? I mean, I would say that, you know, if you ask a lot of folks who are very involved in the protests, I would say that they would argue that he's not representative of the protests in 2019. But and I'll explain why. But just to backtrack a little, so all of those things that you mentioned, particularly the Constitution, are all the things which, you know, they're not the catalyst for the 2019 demonstrations, as you mentioned. You know, the proposal to raise the fares in Santiago, which the public transit system there is run by a private-public partnership with the private sector, you know, being involved in the administration of the transit system. They proposed a transit fare increase. Students began to protest. You know, they were completely dismissed and ridiculed by administrators and public officials, which resulted in, you know, then an outburst that which just happened on October 18th and continued for months thereafter, with, you know, people, the government responding with repression, and that just consistently snowballing because people didn't back down, even when the government threw the military on the streets, something that hadn't been seen since the dictatorship. You know, people did not back down and they continued to be on the streets. And basically, it was only the pandemic that ended up, you know, kind of putting people, quelling the daily street demonstrations all across the country. But in terms of Boric, the reason why those demonstrations kind of happened in that way, and where they culminated in a general sort of call around the need for a new constitution, is because all of those demonstrations that I talked about on an annual basis, even when there were proposals to try to change or reform them, often they would be met with the Constitutional Court, which would rule that changes, that attempts to try to put things under public control, where the problems were identified to be a matter of these things being privatized, which is often the case, right? When we talk about pensions, it's because it's the privatized pensions. When we talk about, you know, water, it's because, you know, water's been privatized. Talk about education, it's because education is entirely privatized. So a lot of times reforms that would be attempted, even mild reforms, would be declared unconstitutional because of the constitution passed under dictatorship, which ruled that made it so that the state is subsidiary to the private sector. That's ingrained in it. So you know, things would come up in the Congress and ultimately be struck down. So the protests ended up, you know, having this general call that needed a new constitution in order to be able to address the roots of the problems that in Chilean society, the inequality, and the lack of opportunity, the poverty that a lot of people have been experiencing, and the hopelessness and despair that, you know, that this was resulting in. Now, why did these protests on some level stop, or how do we get to the Constitutional Convention, as it's called right now? Well, Boric, as a member of Congress and as an elected member of Congress under the Broad Front, which he still currently represents, ended up coming to an agreement with members of the government, which is the Piñera government, to present a proposal that would begin the process of whether, you know, Chileans would approve of starting a process to see if we would reform the constitution. It's long, right? So there was multiple different steps. Anyway, immediately after that, Boric trying to go to the demonstrations would get booed and hissed because he made this agreement, without even consulting his own party. Obviously, a lot of people felt that it didn't actually represent the spirit of, the sacrifice that people were making out in the streets, because it wasn't just demonstrations. Like, you have to recall the number of people that were, arrested, still in jail, some mutilated and maimed, lots of people losing their eyes, some people killed, all these sorts of things, right? So there was a lot of feelings about it and a lot of resentment that from a lot of sectors of the left, particularly to Boric, for having come to that agreement, right? Because there was a lot, even right now, when we talk about what's going to happen with the Constitutional Convention or what's happened right now, there's still a lot of questions. There's still a lot of possibilities, I would argue, for, and probably more possibilities for radical transformative proposals coming out of the Constitutional Convention than from the Boric government. Nonetheless, though, Boric is all of that, right? He was part of the student movement, part of those important movements in the early 2010s or so, but also elected member of Congress that did that. And even though right now there's, like I said, some good possibilities that could come out of that, it was also done in a way that was heavily criticized from a lot of sectors of the left at the time.
Yeah. You talked about some of the barriers in the Senate, and I wanted to ask you about that. Witnessing Boric's victory speech, you just see these throngs of young people in Santiago who are going nuts when he calls for ending neoliberalism. Just this is what they've been fighting for. And it reminded me actually of seeing AMLO's inauguration in Mexico City. I just happened to be there, got to see it. It was the first time, it's rare as a U.S. American to see neoliberalism denounced not on campus with like 12 people in the room. Being actually in the Zocalo with like 100,000 people cheering for the death of neoliberalism was pretty amazing. The first time I'd witnessed anything like that, especially after the whole history of Mexico's politics over the past decades. And yet he's facing enormous institutional barriers, and Chile's system presents them as well. Yeah. How possible is it for Boric to actually make good on this rhetoric, which is inspiring waves of applause on social media around the world, but the reality in Chile seems somewhat grim, especially the political reality in the Senate?
Yeah, like this is where I kind of come back to the issue of, can we expect the death of neoliberalism, which I'm hopeful that there will be, significant defeats or rather victories against neoliberalism in the coming years in Chile. Will those be ushered in by Boric himself, though, I guess is the question. I think he has a role to play. But I don't think I personally am not expecting all of a sudden, significant dramatic changes coming from the executive of government. I'm seeing that there's greater possibilities of those coming still from the streets and mobilizations, which I think at some point will continue as all of these things develop, as well as, from the Constitutional Convention. Because again, this is where, there's going to be a proposal coming in sometime in the next year. The clock for the Constitutional Convention is ticking and it's about to run out. It was only supposed to be, it had a 9-month mandate with possibility of 3-month extension. So it'll kind of be coming to a head sometime in the first few months, first half of 2022, and then it'll be put to vote. But what the things that could come out of that are things which are going to address what do you do with like the privatization of everything in Chile, right? Like that's where there's going to be the most significant challenges to capital and to private ownership, right? Which are really the crux of all these things, right? So that's not going to happen by decree from Boric, but it can happen from this body, which is then going to present the Magna Carta for the country, and the basis for all of the laws in the country, and any sort of legal and social challenges to the privatization and theft, because it's literal theft that happened under the dictatorship of the natural resources of Chile. When we talk about privatization, we talk about Ben mentioned the lithium production in the country. Sokimich, the company, the largest producer of lithium in the world, or at least Latin America, but I'm pretty sure it's the world right now, was a state company, but it was privatized and sold to Pinochet's son-in-law, right? So these are the things that happened and were never rectified in the 30 years of neoliberal democracy, right? And these are the things which have to be addressed and rectified if we're going to really address all the problems that brought people out into the streets in 2019 and before. So yeah, I do think that Boric will have a role to play, but I don't think that those things will come necessarily from La Moneda.
Yeah, and let's talk a bit more about Boric's particular politics. We've been kind of obliquely hinting at this. He ran a campaign explicitly running against Venezuela, against Nicaragua, against Cuba, and I would say in a gratuitous way. I mean, of course, it's common for left-wing candidates in Latin America these days to always have to, when they run for election in any race, whether it's for Parliament, Congress, for a mayor's office, or especially president, they get, if they're on the left, they get these accusations that they're the next Hugo Chavez and that they're going to turn their country into Venezuela. And there's all these lies about Venezuela. Of course, it's portrayed as much worse than it actually is. It's ridiculous, the stereotype. But there are politicians who know how to deal with this gracefully. Well, there are politicians who are principled and defend the sovereignty of Venezuela and Nicaragua and Cuba against brutal attacks by U.S. imperialism, talking about the U.S. blockades and sanctions and coup attempts and all of that. There are other politicians who respond a little more gracefully in a way calling for non-intervention. Like, for instance, you could say AMLO in Mexico has done an okay job. There's certainly things to criticize, but on Venezuela, he's done an okay job of not totally throwing Venezuela under the bus. He doesn't recognize Juan Guaido. But then you have someone like Boric, who frankly went completely beyond, and I would say gratuitously demonized Venezuela, demonized Cuba as dictatorships, and then to an outrageous degree. I mean, this is my view, but his positions on Nicaragua are absolutely ridiculous. On Nicaragua, Boric not only demonized the elected Sandinista government as a supposed dictatorship, he called for sending his solidarity to Cristiana Chamorro, who is a right-wing multimillionaire oligarch funded by the U.S. from the most elite oligarch family in the country. Max has a tweet up here.
Yeah, this is a pretty wild tweet from a few days. We were actually in Caracas at the time, and this is Boric basically denouncing the Venezuelan government for refusing to let basically the U.S. through USAID invade them through this humanitarian aid mission run by Juan Guaido that was just openly admitted later on. They openly admitted it was an attempt to invade and violate the sovereignty of Venezuela. And then if you actually go down into the comments, you can see Boric engaging with his critics, and someone says, "Eres de izquierda?" Like, are you actually, this is leftism? Are you a leftist? And he's like, "Yeah, I am."
Yeah, I am.
Wild.
Well, and let me get up another tweet here, which, I mean, again, like this is gratuitous. This is beyond like being diplomatic. Here he says, "I have no doubt that," he's talking about the election. He's referring to something that is that's put on stage, like it's fake. He's talking about the election in this November in Nicaragua was a farce and does not fulfill basic standards to be considered a legitimate election. He says, I mean, that's bad enough, demonizing the election in Nicaragua, calling it a farce. But then he takes it to such an insane level. And he says, he sends my solidarity to Sergio Ramirez, who is an oligarch, which, I mean, that's a whole long thing, but he's been a U.S. embassy informant since before the Sandinista revolution. Dora Maria Tejes, who's also been a U.S. embassy informant since at least 2006, and has and she supported the coup in Bolivia. And then the worst of all, he misspelled Cristiana Chamorro's name. Cristiana Chamorro is a right-wing oligarch. She's the daughter of the CIA-backed candidate Violeta Barrios Chamorro, who came to power, who supported the Contras and all this. I mean, like, I doubt he even knows much about Nicaraguan politics. He probably didn't even write this tweet, but the fact that he tweeted this, I mean, this is gratuitous. So anyway, the point is that's my 2 cents. Can you explain, what's going on here, and in the context of the Chilean left? Because there are people who have been critical of Boric, but they pointed out, well, Boric is the coalition in the second round of the election, which is called Apruebo Dignidad. It does include the Communist Party, but it also includes right-wing social democratic parties. It includes liberal, left liberal parties. So this, and also during his campaign, Boric actually condemned openly on TV. He condemned the Communist Party. He gave this interview on CNN Chile, in which he said that the Communist Party of Chile is going to regret defending Venezuela. And so, can you explain the kind of divisions within Chile, the Chilean left? You also mentioned that Boric has been part of the Frente Amplio, the broad front, but then there's also a separate coalition which is led by the Communist Party, which is Chile Digno, dignified Chile. So there are people pointing out correctly that in the presidential, the second round of the presidential election, it's true that the Communist Party was part of this coalition because they weren't going to support the far-right candidate, Kast, obviously. But in the Congress, in the bicameral Congress, the Communist Party is not part of Boric's alliance. They have their own alliance. So the Chilean left is actually more complex than a lot of people who are praising Boric, I think, understand.
Yeah, and I'm definitely not going to be one to try to justify those positions of Boric because they're positions that I don't agree with, right? And I will say that a significant number of the people that I know, right, Chileans that I know that are activists, not even like members of any particular party. Some yes, some not. There wasn't that many people who were enthusiastic about Boric, right? Like about Boric as the individual, right? Whether they agree with the positions on Venezuela and Nicaragua and Cuba or not, right? Again, just reemphasizing that whole thing of like Boric was, elected, but the reasons for that are multiple, and it isn't, like because there's a lot of confidence in a specific person or that he's a particularly charismatic figure, which I don't think few people I think would argue that he's a particularly charismatic figure. So with regards to how the dynamics and contours of the Chilean left are at this point, I would say that like really the only the Chilean Communist Party is really the most solid part of the Chilean left. When we talk about the broad front, it is a relatively new organization that really only coalesced around the 2017 elections. It's been, it has the different components, different parties of it go through different sort of waves. They've had a lot of divisions. Some of their leaders kind of have, some of them have separated. Like Boric himself was a member of that autonomous movement, then kind of left that. Another leader, the mayor from the city that my family's from in Valparaiso, Jorge Sharp, left the movement, but is still part of the coalition. A lot of the parties, like especially around the demonstrations and how to reconcile with, the right-wing talking points about violence and whatnot, and had the positions to take towards the constitutional convention. It created a lot of crisis within those movements. So, like a lot of those newer left-wing formations are not as politically solid and haven't really had to weather storms yet. So I think that we'll see what happens, in the first few months and probably before inauguration, when we start seeing, what the composition of the cabinet is going to be, right? Like who is included and who isn't. And this is where we can kind of look at Chilean history, right? Because, even before Allende, even before the Popular Unity government, there were other popular governments. There was the Frente Popular in the 1930s. which included the socialists. There was even immediately, after World War II, the Videla government, which had communist ministers. And this is where we start seeing the first interventions, or the first prominent interventions from Washington, identifying that one of the keys to weakening the left and separating its, or rather, mitigating its possibilities for being able to play a role in politics and shifting things to the left, is to create divisions, try to isolate it. At that time, the Videla government, the Washington sent its envoy, and then shortly afterwards, the communist ministers were removed from the government. Right. I anticipate that we'll start seeing that. I'm sure that those things are already in play. But there are people that have been closer to Boric, Camila Vallejo being one of them. Still a member of the Communist Party. I'm not sure. I'm going to be interested in the next few months what positions the Communist Party has in this government, particularly who's going to be the foreign minister, who's going to be the minister of finance, right? Because those are going to be the keys to seeing how much they're going to push the envelope here, right? Like what role they're going to play in the region. Boric is, like I said, one of the things that's always kind of identified. He's one of the things he's always demonstrated is that he kind of freelances, right? Like he doesn't really, as much as some of those politics around libertarian socialism or whatever try to say that they're that they want to hold politicians accountable. He himself hasn't been very accountable to his own parties, right? So in terms of his ability to kind of carry a coherent perspective, particularly on regional politics, I'm not expecting that. I don't think many people in Chile are going to expect that. But in terms of what state policy is going to be beyond his own personal statements, I think that's kind of more the determining factor. And that we'll start to see how that plays out with the cabinet appointments, I think.
Yeah, and Pablo, really quickly, can you explain the kind of public perception of the Communist Party in Chile? Because people watching this who don't really understand Chilean politics might be surprised that we keep talking about the Communist Party, because in a place like the US, the Communist Party USA is a very small group. It doesn't have much influence. But in Chile, the Communist Party is one of the major parties. They have members of Congress. They have over a dozen deputies. You mentioned they have important figures like Camila Vallejo, who was a student leader who became a lawmaker. They also have mayors. I mean, they're a significant political party. And in the first round of the election, before this primary process, which you can explain, they had this figure, Daniel Jadue, from the Communist Party, who was leading in all of the polls. In fact, early polls showed him that he had more support than Gabriel Boric. There's a lot of popular enthusiasm for Jadue. Can you explain who Daniel Jadue is? Can you explain why he ended up losing the open primary that made Boric the candidate? And also maybe you can talk about the fact, which I think is important, that Jadue is Palestinian and has been a very outspoken supporter of Palestinian rights. And in Chile, it actually has one of the largest Palestinian diaspora communities in the world.
Absolutely. Which my family's a part of. The Daniel Jadue actually used to be the spokesperson for the Chilean Palestinian Federation, but now he's more known for his current role as mayor of Recoleta, which is a borough of Santiago, which he's already held for a number of terms. And his popularity in large part is because of a lot of the programs that he's implemented through his position in the mayor's office, which have directly challenged the neoliberal barriers and the neoliberal structure that's been imposed on Chile. One of the first programs that he implemented was popular pharmacies. If you've ever been to Chile, anyone's ever been to Chile, you'll see that there's pharmacies everywhere, right? They're so common. It's like every second store is a pharmacy, and all of these products are inordinately expensive. And a lot of these pharmacies, actually a few years ago, the pharmacies were found guilty of colluding to price fix, right? So one of the things that Hadwe did is he started up these popular pharmacies, buying directly from producers and using the municipality to sell to the population at a significantly reduced price, right? So things which, actually should be unconstitutional, but he's been able to do anyway. These are the type of things, and he's replicated that sort of same model a number of different ways, again, through this municipality in Santiago, and that's been replicated across the country. It's things like that that have kind of put him in the limelight on the national stage. And like you said, leading up to the primary, Boric actually was a latecomer to this whole primary process, right? It was more or less up until this point, everyone thought that it was going to be Hadwe who was going to be the candidate, right? And Boric was a latecomer, kind of got thrown in last minute. The primary process I found significantly flawed, as someone who went in and voted. You didn't have to be part of a registered party to go in and vote. Also, there was there was a number of different parties that didn't field a candidate. So in terms of the Socialist Party, who has a large membership base, and in spite of their name are not very socialist, they all went to vote. So when the primary vote got tallied, Boric came out significantly ahead of Hadwe, but that wasn't necessarily kind of reflective of what the feeling was and what the preferences were of people that were part of the parties that comprised that actual coalition that was holding the primaries, if that makes sense. So yeah, it was in my estimation, I really wanted to see Daniel Hadwe as the candidate. I think he would have presented a much more kind of coherent vision and bold vision, and he would have demonstrated, he would have really used the executive of government to push the agenda and to really to really try to put a death knell to neoliberalism. I'm not 100% confident that Boric is going to really do that. I think he's going to be a slightly better version of some of the things that we saw under the Bachelet government. That's I think kind of almost that's the more realistic, going back to what you said in terms of being realistic rebels here. The more realistic perspective from what we can expect from a Boric government. But that's not necessarily the only thing that we can expect from Chilean mass movements, right? That's where I kind of go back to that piece.
Well, hopefully he won't get an award from Hillary Clinton as Bachelet did. I mean, she's really paying her dues, but yeah, I mean, I've been a little bit worried about all the positive press I'm seeing for Boric, and seeing, mainstream publications, Western government state media like Deutsche Welle kind of praise him as a leftist millennial. The term leftist millennial actually scares the crap out of me. I think of these bread tube weirdos screaming about red brown alliances, and coupled with his tweets about Venezuela and Nicaragua. But I get it,
Well, Max, I mean, sorry to cut you off, but if I had to describe Boric to people, I actually think bread tube kind of politics is the perfect description. It's like this kind of left social democratic liberalism that is anti-communist and is soft on imperialism, but is also kind of tied to social movements a little bit. So there's good things about it, but a lot of it is really soft. And when push comes to shove, they often end up on the wrong side. I mean, that's really what Boric.
And we also have other examples, and unfortunately not good examples of in Latin America for this, right? I think of Bukele, for example, in El Salvador, right? Who was an FMLN mayor, who was a member of the FMLN for a long time. But, on some level, the early days of Bukele, he was talked about in a similar way, right? Like a millennial progressive with a bold vision, not part of the traditional sort of Stalinist left or whatever, right? However they wanted to paint the left, and now we see how he is, right? Also, I know you guys covered a lot of things in Ecuador, in a country that I lived in, and obviously Lenin Moreno wasn't a millennial, right? But he was also painted as a moderate progressive that wasn't going to be as stubborn and wasn't going to have the attitude that Correa had, and we saw where that went, right? So I really hope that I would rather Boric be like Bachelet than be like those folks for sure. But I do have more confidence that people in the streets will hold Boric to account again, because I really don't think, as much as you saw an outpouring on the streets of Santiago for the last couple of days, that is an outpouring for everything that people have been fighting for, rather than for what Boric is.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of where I wanted to take this. Just another aspect of Boric's background is that he's a member of this group, Progressive International. And they now have this group kind of came out of nowhere 2 years ago, and now they have someone in an executive position in a pretty like a mid-sized we call it a middle class economy, or maybe upper middle class by South American standards. Yanis Varoufakis, who's an executive of this group, praised his election, and we've kind of worked with them or worked alongside them, monitoring and covering various elections, very contentious elections across Latin America where there was a leftist candidate, and they would come in as observers and play, I would say, a positive role. But Progressive International, if you want to situate them within Latin America, they would align more with the Puebla group, the more moderate center-left countries, which, and this group, I mean, Ben can probably go off on it more. It really feels like it's been set up as a counterweight to the troika of resistance, or what Bolton called the troika of tyranny, Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela. And so really the only thing that matters in Latin America for someone elected to an executive position from the perspective of Washington is not whether they call themselves a socialist or a leftist millennial or whatever. It's how they relate to the US policy towards the troika of resistance. And there's also Bolivia there, which is, I think, they're more aligned with the Puebla group, but their grassroots movement, I think, is like a solid resistance movement. So Bolivia and Chile have this long, very antagonistic history. Bolivia has been denied a port by what they call kind of Chilean aggression. And so I wanted you to kind of go beyond Boric, look at the possible figures that would be in his cabinet, the people around the foreign policy, his foreign policy advisors, and project how Chile could be different than it has been as a member of the Lima group with respect to the countries that are directly targeted by the US, and what would the consequence be for a figure like him. I mean, I know he doesn't have CIA ties like BreadTube does right now, but obviously they're trying to court him and offer him various incentives. So how do you see a potential Chilean foreign policy here with respect to the divisions in the Latin American left?
Yeah, I think that's going to be one of the main points of contention, right? In the group that starts to kind of form around Boric at this point, and I would not be surprised if it changes along the way. We saw how Pedro Castillo in Peru, his foreign minister, was resigned very shortly after being appointed, after significant pressure was put to bear on the Castillo government, right? So, and
by the military.
Yeah.
And we see, sorry to cut in, we see Lula proposing a vice presidential candidate who's historically very friendly to Washington.
Right. Yeah. So, we're probably also talking about like what this, not to be flippant, but like pink tie 2.0 or whatever, kind of looks like in comparison, particularly to the first, wave of it. Which is perhaps a whole other conversation. But to your point, or to your question around what it looks like, who's going to be involved, I'm not sure if at least initially, if Chile will pull out of the Lima group. However, I don't see them participating. I think they'll probably take a position similar to what Argentina did in the very kind of first days of Alberto Fernandez, where they didn't pull out but didn't send anybody to meetings if they start meeting in that sort of way, and probably wait till a moment, to pull out of it for whatever reason, and maybe cite some of the other governments. I do also want to point that a lot of the governments, and I know Lucho Arce, a lot of the left leaders from the region did congratulate Boric, and I think that there's probably a lot of kind of things happening in the background that we're not aware of.
As did Managua, Ortega.
Well, a quick note on this, because some people were pointing this out to try to give Boric more leftist credentials than he deserves. That's diplomacy. I mean, every leader does that for every election, pretty much. I mean, there are a few exceptions, like the U.S. refusing to recognize Venezuelan elections. But even Ivan Duque, the far-right narco president of Colombia, also congratulated Boric. Yeah. So that's how diplomacy works. I mean, even if you don't have good relations with the country, if it's clear that one candidate won the election, then you send your greetings to them. So, I mean, it's not insignificant that Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua congratulated Boric on his victory, considering, he did attack them and they have the right to be angry at him. But as an act of basic diplomacy, of course they're going to congratulate him, because of course they want to try to have good relations. So I want to discourage people from reading too much into a few tweets congratulating a presidential candidate on his victory, because I mean, they do that. No,
it'll be more
significant.
Election. It'll be more significant to see if they're invited to attend the inauguration, right? Like, I mean, that's where you'll see some of the more substantive parts of where that's being headed.
And if Boric recognizes Maduro as the legitimate constitutional president of Venezuela, which he is,
right, and with the Venezuelan opposition and their parallel shadow government kind of falling apart at the seams, before our eyes right now, where they're debating. There's Julio Borges, debating already openly whether they should just kind of fold. I mean, that may be imminent anyway. It may just happen de facto by the time we're looking at March, right? But those will be more significant parts of how the foreign policy develops. Ben, you and I were talking kind of before we went live here around the ghost of the specter of Chilezuela that has been part of Chilean policy, has been part of the right-wing media narrative for a number of years now. So that's obviously going to continue to be a thing, right? That is pushed in Chilean media to try to, one, continue to scare people and present the possibility of a cleavage. On the other end, try to get the left and the Boric government to take the bait. And unfortunately, I think that Boric is always going to take the bait, because he always has, right? So I don't anticipate that he's going to veer significantly. Perhaps he'll put a statesman cap on and be a little bit more diplomatic. However, I don't see that he's going to take firmer positions. I don't think he's going to go the way of AMLO or Alberto Fernandez or some of the other leaders in the region that aren't necessarily pushing radical socialist transformations, but that are still at the very least reaffirming the right to sovereignty of nations and kind of peaceful coexistence, respect for the institutions of countries to operate as they need to, and for people's right to elect their leaders. I hope that at least state policy starts reflecting that. I think that there's going to be some people, not just folks from the Communist Party and other more sensible people from in and around Boric's own party, but there's another person that I would expect to have some sort of role in the government is Marco Enriquez Ominami, who was very close to, if it's a different group that obviously no longer sort of exists, but at the time when the Correa government was pushing, to build a sort of not a counterweight, but something that would operate almost in parallel to the Sao Paulo group, kind of a progressive Latin American ELAP, the Encuentro Latinoamericano Progresista, the progressive Latin American encounter. Ominami played a significant sort of role in that and was kind of a figure in all of those meetings. So I would suspect that, and he got 12% of the vote in the first round. Endorsed Boric afterwards. Has more connections to the Latin American left than the Broad Front has, for example. So I do think that there's going to be there are people that are well positioned to play roles like that and try to have a more sensible foreign policy for the Boric government. But like I said, I really, this is where I don't want to understate the role of imperialism, to try to create that wedge and to try to push things in the opposite direction, right? Because I think they're going to be working at fever pitch to try to stop that.
Yeah, and getting back to a point Max made just about the regional politics, I was saying this on Twitter, and just really briefly, my view is that this narrative of the pink tide, I mean, first of all, I think we have to problematize it. In Latin America, people don't use the term pink tide. I mean, you can say it kind of was a progressive wave of left-wing and revolutionary governments, but even from the beginning, as you've been kind of referencing, Pablo, there were weak links. Michelle Bachelet, for an example, being a major weak link in the original so-called pink tide. And for me, I think the most important thing is not necessarily talking about the pink tide as some project, but rather talking about regional integration as the project into what's called the Patria Grande, which is the idea of the great motherland, the great fatherland, unifying Latin America from Mexico down to Argentina, and including the Caribbean as well. And for me, the most important creation, the most important institutional creation of the so-called pink tide was the ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance. And we've seen that after every single US-backed coup in Latin America, any country that was a member of the ALBA immediately left. So in the case of the 2009 coup in Honduras against Manuel Zelaya, immediately Honduras left the ALBA. In the case of Lenin Moreno, who was basically, it was basically a coup in Honduras, a kind of low-level coup. We saw that Lenin Moreno immediately left the ALBA. He also kicked out UNASUR, which is another institution of regional integration. It had the capital actually in Ecuador. And then we saw in the 2019 coup in Bolivia that immediately, a week after the coup in November of 2019, the coup regime left the ALBA as well, the Bolivarian Alliance. Although after the election last year that was won by the Movement Towards Socialism Party, Bolivia rejoined the ALBA. So for me, I think the most important question is, what will Chile's role be vis-a-vis regional integration? And I can't say I'm very optimistic. Max mentioned that what we've actually seen is that during the original so-called pink tide, the ALBA did bring some more unity. Ecuador and Honduras were part of the ALBA. Brazil had very good relations with the ALBA. Of course, there was a kind of soft coup against the impeachment against Dilma Rousseff, and then the imprisonment of Lula da Silva. And now with Bolsonaro, he left UNASUR, and he's been really aggressively against all attempts at regional integration. But then Max mentioned that you now have the creation of the Puebla group, and not to necessarily criticize it too harshly. The Puebla group has played a positive role in some ways, but in other ways, it's played a negative role by dividing the Latin American left into two different poles. So then you have the Bolivarian Alliance, the members of which it's led by Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Bolivia. And then you have the Puebla group. And very conspicuously, the Puebla group did not invite any politicians from Venezuela, Cuba, or Nicaragua. The Puebla group did invite the opposition left-wing forces in Uruguay, in Chile, in countries where they were not even in government. They didn't even have state power. But the Puebla group was very clear that it did not want to be in any way involved with Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. They have a boycott of the Troika of Resistance. And my fear is that although it's good that Boric was elected, what that's going to do is it's going to further divide the Latin American left. And you're going to have these two axes where, Bolivia actually is the country that goes between the two, and it plays a positive role, I think, in trying to help bring them together more. But the other countries, especially Argentina and now Chile and also Mexico, have taken a very aggressive line against Nicaragua going so far as to withdraw their ambassadors. Mexico and Argentina withdrew their ambassadors from Nicaragua. And actually, Argentina has been working with the Biden administration against Nicaragua. And I think behind the scenes, the Biden administration is probably trying to offer debt relief or something in return for isolating Nicaragua. Alberto Fernandez and his vice president, Kirchner, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, have very negative relationship. They've been fighting a lot. Her allies withdrew from his cabinet in protest in recent elections because his party, the Frente de Todos, did very badly in regional elections in the primaries. So what my concern is that although it's good Kast lost, my concern is that the victory of Boric is going to further strengthen this attempt to divide the Latin American left. And European so-called left-wing parties play an important role in this, and I think a very nefarious role, especially the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, which is the think tank that is the arm of the SPD, the Social Democratic Party in Germany, which now is in government in Germany. And I mean, it's a whole long conversation we don't have time to get into, but the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung is allied with the Frente Amplio and has organized events with Apruebo Dignidad and the Frente Amplio, which is the kind of Boric wing. So that's an example of a German government-funded think tank allied with now the ruling party, the party that has the plurality in the majority government, the coalition government in Germany right now. The point is that there's a lot of institutional momentum pushing this split in the Latin American left, encouraging the Puebla group, encouraging Mexico and Argentina and now Chile to boycott Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, and also to divide the ALBA. Because at the end of the day, I think what the US empire and what European countries fear the most in Latin America is that project of regional integration. And I can't say I'm optimistic that Chile under Boric is going to have anything to do with that project of regional integration. That's my analysis. I'm curious what you think about that, Pablo.
Yeah, like I don't disagree with you. I mean, I don't think this is where I guess I was saying in terms of where we see this new this new dynamic of left-wing governments and being elected, and how that compares to the first wave beginning with the election of Chavez, then Correa, Evo, and some of the other governments that are kind of in and around and are included as part of that, the FSLN in 2000, in the mid 2000s as well. I think even at that time there was I'm not seeing the same kind of push.
Looks like we
Pablo
lost
Pablo. Left the building.
So Max, go ahead, and I'm curious what you think. I'm going to get Pablo back, but you can give maybe your 2 cents.
Well, I'll just talk about what I was going to ask him about next, because as we know from the history of how Salvador Allende was sabotaged, first sanctions were imposed and investors, U.S. corporations, multinationals began to sabotage the Chilean economy. And this was it culminated with the famous quote, I think it was by Nixon to Kissinger, make the Chilean economy scream.
Make the economy scream.
Yeah. Even with, we got Pablo back. I'll wait to hear him finish his thoughts before I start talking about the economic situation.
The phone is overheating, and I think it's only giving me a couple more minutes.
That was Ben's fault. He just overheats everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we'll wrap up soon. Go ahead, Pablo.
Yeah, no, like I don't see from this wave of governments and leaders like kind of the same visions for regional and even national transformations that we saw from the first wave, right? Like with all due respect to the and as much as I support and I'm also encouraged by these things. We don't have the same discussions of around socialism in the 21st century. The building sort of regional blocks and regional institutions to counter imperialism. We don't like. I mean, we're not seeing that in the same way as we saw during those periods. Hopefully, it'll develop, and this is where I think there has to be a role. We have to look beyond just some of the figures that are getting elected, right, and look at the movements behind them and how those are developing. You mentioned Bolivia. Obviously, Bolivia has a much more sort of solid base in order to be able to push their government and their leaders in a certain direction. I think that there is some elements of that in Chile. It doesn't necessarily have, I guess, as much centralized structure to it as you would see in a place like Bolivia or in other places in Nicaragua or even still in Venezuela. But these are some of the things that I think we're gonna see play out. But do I expect that to be part of the initial Boric government plan? When they released their first 100 days and all those sorts of things, is that going to be reflected in like the first statements from their foreign ministers? I don't think so, but I would be happy to be wrong.
I would be happy for that too. I was just after Ben overheated your phone, I was just kind of talking about the economic situation, how Chile's economy was sabotaged deliberately under Allende, and how we see some signs of that now.
Sabotaged by the U.S.
By the U.S. Well,
Yeah.
and by multinationals with under U.S. direction. And we see some version of that now. They say they're getting skittish, and it's mainly these mining firms because Chile is, the major copper mining center. Ben mentioned lithium, but really these are copper mining companies from Canada, Australia, and then Wall Street. I think it was AIG or one of these, investment advisors warned investors not to invest in Chile. Bloomberg right now, Bloomberg Linea, the Latin American site, is filled with articles warning about the leftist rage in Chile and how it's making a Wall Street bastion into a kind of socialist center. And Boric has talked about or made noises about nationalizing some copper mines. He's also talked or promised to close a major copper mine, if I'm not incorrect.
Yep.
And so I think this is the real
that was initially that was recently passed. He was talked about that.
Okay, well, I think this is this is the factor that will determine the course of his administration on so many issues. So can you just address the fact that mining firms are pulling out? That, I mean, the Mexican peso is devalued as a result of this. The Argentinian currency has taken a hit, and Wall Street is openly campaigning against Chile.
Yeah, no, and to that, Kast. Let's remember that Kast was actually in the U.S. a couple of weeks before the vote, meeting with representatives of U.S. Capitol as well as representatives in government of U.S. Capitol, Marco Rubio and others, right? Absolutely, whether Boric is a soft progressive or whether he's a raging socialist just waiting to kind of come out, they're going to put pressure and they're going to make threats through these mechanisms, right? Through trying to have the markets signal that, hey, you better toe the line, otherwise we're going to make your economy scream like we did before. So and mining is going to be a central component of that, right? Because mining is where the bulk of foreign capital is. Chilean copper was never denationalized after Allende, but concessions were privatized, and other natural resources were fully privatized. Like I mentioned, lithium, but forests, like water. Chile's, I think, the only country in the world that has privatized water, not just water administration, but the water itself, right? All those are natural resources that are in the hands of private capital, and now it's being debated about bringing those back under public control. And I agree with you. That's going to be, the thing which determines, what's going to play out. Is this thing going to be a disappointment, or is it going to be something that at least, carries things forward and tries to push the agenda of those protests, to address the things that people want, because people want to see these things. People want to see the country move forward in a positive, progressive direction. And this is where we're also going to see how it plays out with relation to imperialism, right? Because that is going to create the wedge, right, between this incoming government and international capital, and particularly the U.S.
I got one more question. I know our audience wants us to address this. We probably should have brought it up earlier. There's a clip of Boric describing Israel as an apartheid state. He said that he supports BDS. The Jewish community, which likely does not represent all Jews as the so-called Jewish community in the US does, which seems to be a collection of organizations that represent more elite interests, has condemned Kast and has condemned Boric, warned about his threat. They weren't very concerned about the potential son of a Nazi being elected. Is there any hope that he can actually turn that rhetoric into concrete action, do something at the UN?
I mean, I think it's like this is an interesting thing actually about when we mentioned the Palestinian community. The Palestinian community in Chile is not necessarily, it has a lot of power, right? Like, it's not necessarily a community that votes left and is identified with the left historically, actually, but it has the positions that you would expect around Palestine, and they're going to push in that direction.
Chile has one of the largest, for our listeners, viewers, Chile has one of the largest Palestinian exile communities in the world, and they're very business oriented. And there we go. Pablo is frozen.
Yeah, we'll see if we can get him back.
It's a good freeze. Like, I always get frozen like this. Like,
yeah,
like
exactly.
He's kind of like male model freeze. Okay, well, yeah, I mean, maybe we could bring up that clip actually while we're waiting for Pablo to unfreeze. I mean, we work our guests really hard here, and it's kind of like free labor.
Yeah, here, I'll get up the clip of Boric. Here it is. Yeah, he says Israel is a genocidal and murderous state. Here we go.
Yeah, I got it right here.
Let me. Here, I'll translate here. He said, the host says to Boric, you said that Israel is a genocidal and murderous state. Do you still maintain that? And he said, yes, I maintain it. And he said the same thing for Turkey and the Kurds, and he says yes.
Todos los países que están violando los tratados internacionales, como es el caso de Israel, como es el caso de Chile, como es el caso, tú mencionabas, Arabia Saudita, o el caso de Turquía, tienen que cumplir con la normativa internacional.
And here he does his typical rap, and he says, all of the countries that violate international law and human rights should be condemned, including Israel, China, and Turkey. So he always does this thing, it's what liberals often do. They'll say, or social democrats often do. They're like, yeah, well, I condemn the human rights violations in all countries all around the world, in China and Venezuela and Nicaragua, but also in Colombia and Israel and Turkey. So, I mean, that's his whole rap. But the fact that he says it on Israel, I mean, it is something to applaud, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, it's consistent with the politics of the broad front, and I think it's just part of what it means to be a left-winger in your 30s right now anywhere in the world. Is Palestine solidarity has really become a part of it. And in Chile, you have this Palestinian community, which has been there for a good amount of time. They are not all hardcore political BDS activists, but they represent a significant constituency. So I'm actually not shocked to hear that rhetoric. At the same time, I question what could happen to Chile if I mean, I don't know if Chile has ever interfered or voted for a resolution condemning Israel in recent times. And there's also a significant evangelical community there. But in any case, this is another another area of concern for Washington. And obviously, Israel has the capacity to do harm in Latin America. I mean, it's active there. So we'll see. I just thought it was interesting to bring that up. And
here, Pablo's back. Hey, Pablo, sorry. I know that your phone keeps overheating. The conversation is just too spicy, but
I think you and Boric both have Pegasus spyware now after we played that clip.
Yeah.
Oh, then I missed the spiciest part then, I guess.
Well, we just played him denouncing Israel and then China and Turkey in the next breath. But, the controversial clip that, has all pro-Israel media worked up right now, we played that.
Yeah, well, Pablo,
I object to him calling Israel a state, though. But
there's two things that I wanted to ask, and then we can wrap up here. One, well, we're on the subject of copper and lithium. I wanted to emphasize how important this is. I think a lot of people who kind of know vaguely about the modern history of Chile, they know about the first 9/11 attacks in 1973, in which the CIA overthrew Salvador Allende. But what is not as well known about the 73 coup in Chile is also the role of the copper industry, especially the Anaconda Corporation, and the nationalization of copper, which Allende declared in 1971. And he famously referred to that as the second independence of Chile. The first independence being independence from Spanish colonialism, the second independence being the nationalization of the copper. And we've seen recently discussion of the idea of lithium coups. We saw the coup in the November 2019 coup in Bolivia was definitely partially inspired by lithium. I'm not going to say it's the only factor. Of course, there was also the U.S. wanted to remove Evo Morales. Bolivia is part of the ALBA. It's the threat of a good example of socialist policies growing the economy and all these things. But an important factor is lithium. We saw that Elon Musk did this dumb, flippant tweet where he said, we'll coup whoever we want. So I just wanted to mention that historical context of the nationalization of copper being a core element of the project of the Chilean left. And what I have seen from following Chilean politics and from talking to Chilean activists and journalists in the past several years, especially a good friend of mine, Pablo Allende, who is the grandson of Salvador Allende. One of the things that he constantly talks about is that you mentioned that after the restoration of democracy in Chile and the famous referendum, the vote sí to end Pinochet, right? To end the Pinochet regime. There was never a deep Pinochetization. And we saw the maintenance of the maintaining of these same neoliberal policies baked into the Constitution. And specifically, there was never an attempt by the so-called Socialist Party, you mentioned, it's not so socialist, by the government of Michelle Bachelet and others, there was never an attempt to challenge the private ownership, really, of the copper. So I'm wondering where you think that initiative is right now in the Chilean left. I know that Pablo Allende, he's not a part of a major party, and he recently ran in the election for the Constitutional Convention representatives. Do you think that there is much momentum for the idea of nationalization of copper? And this is part of the question, what could the role be of the Constitutional Convention be? We saw that in the Constitution, in the plebiscite 2 years ago, 3 years ago now, basically, for the constitutional referendum, there was massive support. I believe it was 78% support for rewriting the Constitution. And then most recently, in the votes for the representatives for the Constitutional Convention, the left, there were two different coalitions, but the left won a very slim majority. It's very slim, so that makes the possibility of radical changes to the Constitution maybe a bit difficult. But do you have confidence that the Chilean left can make nationalization of copper part of the national dialogue, the national discussion, and could it potentially be part of that process of the constitutional conventions?
Yeah, so Chilean copper is nationalized per se, but like then we got private concessions, and then we got the issue of taxation, right, which are really the issues that are at the forefront of the copper issue. But there's a whole bunch of other issues with regards to nationalization of the lithium that you mentioned. We didn't mention the forestries, right, which is when we talk about the Mapuche land issues, the Mapuche indigenous people in the south of Chile, and the repression that they face for protecting their territories against the encroachment, the increasing encroachment of the logging companies, which are a big part of like the Chilean ruling class itself, right? Like those are some of the major issues. We all water, public nationalization is already kind of part of the debate around some of those things, right? Particularly around the thing of lithium. Even Boric has talked about creating a national lithium company. So that even of itself isn't, what I would argue for, right? If we want to talk about restitution for the dictatorship and all the things that happened there, is not creating just a company, but nationalizing the company that was, the national company, and then got sold at pennies to the dollar to Pinochet's son-in-law, right? Like, I mean, these sorts of thefts that happened at the barrel of a gun during the dictatorship, right? Which, like, to me, that would be justice. I hope that, I know that obviously there's people that support that, right? But the Constitutional Convention definitely has the ability to put those things on the agenda. The left won, a majority, but part of the thing that was criticized around the process is because the Constitution is the way it is right now, the way that it was crafted by the Pinochet's architects. It needs a supermajority in order to be able to kind of come before the electorate. It needs to be passed by supermajority within the Constitutional Convention, but that supermajority is there, right? If you count the independents, who many of them are kind of like progressives, or regionalists at the very least, right? So there definitely is that possibility, and so that's why in the first few months of 2022, we're going to see all these things play out. We're going to see what is actually going to be, the elements of the Constitution that people are going to be voting on, right? What's going to make it and what's not going to make it, and how is that going to reflect or not the things that people were going out into the streets and facing military and bullets and all that sort of stuff for. And secondly, what the composition of the Boric government is, who's playing a role, and what they're signaling is going to be their priorities, both nationally as well as within their international and regional politics.
Well, really quickly, Pablo, just to clarify, my understanding is that, there is partial state ownership through Codelco, right, is the state copper company. But my understanding is that only a minority, like something around 1/3 of the copper is nationalized, is publicly owned. But my understanding is that the majority is still extracted by private companies, and then they export it as a raw material. They don't even process it. So it's pure resource extraction, basically, for profit.
Yeah, so it's nationalized on paper, right? Like, so Pinochet never reversed that nationalization on paper, but in de facto, right? This is where, we kind of get into the concessions in the amount that they pay in taxes in terms of how the tax structures, were set up, is like, sometimes they hardly pay anything at all. So it is almost like they own it, right? But on paper, right? Like and in terms of even the Pinochet's constitution, the copper is still nationally owned. But again, right, that doesn't mean anything, right, when the resources are still being extracted by multinationals and exported, and there's very little kind of coming back to the country, right? That's obviously not the purpose of making a resource a public good. The purpose of making a resource a public good is so that the rents from it can be used to fund, the services that people want and demand.
Yeah, and I want to point out that Goldman Sachs recently referred to copper as the new oil. And Goldman Sachs also, and other banks and large corporations have been referring to it as a major national security concern for the United States, given how much copper is consumed by the US government, by the military, and especially what they point out here is green technology. Well, I mean, they're using green in a different context here, but the term green, the word green is important here because not only is lithium important for batteries and renewable energy, but copper production is going to massively increase to build that technology.
Including the battery for Pablo's phone, which is probably about to explode. Thanks so much for volunteering so much of your time.
I feel bad for holding you. I swear I have one final question. I just have to mention it because I addressed it briefly in the beginning. The last thing, and then I'll let your phone rest and cool down. Can you briefly address
we should pay you time and a half for this, but
one other issue we haven't addressed, which I think is important, and I feel remiss not mentioning it, is the Mapuche community, the indigenous community, the largest indigenous community in Chile. That was something that was also part of the estallido social, the big protests 2 years ago. It was not only about the neoliberal policies, but also the mistreatment of the Mapuche community. Can you just talk about the indigenous struggle? Because anyone who has seen photos or video of the big protests in Chile in the past, in 2019, but even more recently, you often see the flag of the Mapuche nation. So can you talk about that role and potentially what we could see going forward with a Boric government? With one of the few good things is maybe he might actually provide more support and autonomy for the Mapuche community.
Yeah, absolutely. So like very quickly, the historical overview is that the Mapuche communities that straddle into the south of Argentina and Chile, are communities that have been those nations have been long resisting, right? Like, I mean, the Spanish were never actually able to conquer that territory. And it was actually only after, the wars of the Pacific where Chile, under the pressure from British industrialists, waged war against Bolivia and Peru for Bolivia trying to impose tariffs, which is why you have the situation right now of Bolivia being landlocked. After that war, given that they had already mobilized their military, that's when they sent the military afterwards to the south and then took over the south and took over effectively control of the south of Chile. But the Mapuche community was never defeated, right? And it never came to an agreement, right, with the Chilean state. They maintain that they have a right to autonomy and control over their territory. So they've been waging this struggle for this. Oftentimes that's looked violent because the Chilean military and the police, the national police, the carabineros, have a specific specially trained force, I think, which is trained, if I'm not mistaken, actually in Israel, to deal with Mapuche resistance, right? The Comando Jungla, the Jungle Command. So this is where there's very frequent, and actually just last week there was more indigenous protesters killed, and you have this happen. It's factored into, and it's been a part, particularly in the south, of the demonstrations discussing these issues. In the south of Chile, it's something that Kast, which is one of his strongholds, they try to project the Mapuche community and their struggle as being terroristic, right? That being the Mapuche people as, being terrorists, and that they sabotage the forestries and all of these sorts of things. A lot of these things have been shown to be black flags. That's been also some other things which probably we don't have time to get into, but it's been uncovered that, some of these things which have been blamed on Mapuche activists and Mapuche organizations have been done by the Chilean police. But right now, obviously, it's something that is still being very much discussed in the Constitutional Convention, that the president of the Constitutional Convention, Elisa Loncon, is a Mapuche activist and community leader. So that's one thing that I think we can definitely expect, some movement on. But again, it's not going to be movement without contention, right? It's because it is something that isn't, when we talk about rights from Mapuche people, we're talking about rights over land and resources as well. So it is something that is still going to prompt a strong reaction from Chilean capital.
Well, that not to end on that note, because it's like the least important. I should have mentioned it earlier, but with that, I mean, we're at 90 minutes, so I think it's a good place to wrap up. We were speaking with Pablo Vivanco. You can follow him on Twitter at P Vivanco Guzman. And do you want to tell people where they can find some of your work, Pablo? You did a documentary about the 2019 protests.
Yeah, we did some stuff. We're on the ground as it kind of began. Stuff with, you can go on Redfish and look at some of those pieces. There's actually some of my colleagues went a bit after and did some sort of follow-up stuff, hoping to be able to get back there sometime soon and document. Obviously, the pandemic has made traveling a little complicated, so I haven't veered too far from where I'm currently at. But you'll be able to see and get a better picture of what happened on the ground. It could probably fill in some of the blanks in terms of, explaining how Boric got elected, but also some of the other things which, exactly, and also the background of how it became, how all these protests ended up turning into something where people were demanding a new constitution, right? Which is also something that was a challenge to explain for a lot of folks. You don't see that very often, mass demonstrations for people calling for a constitution.
Yeah, and for viewers and listeners, you can go check out Pablo's excellent documentary. It's called Chile Awakens: The End of the Neoliberal Miracle, in scare quotes. It's a great documentary.
Thanks a lot, Pablo. Lots of props for you in the chat. And I feel like I went to school, so look forward to following your work in the future and having you back.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
Peace.
And thanks to everyone who commented today. Thanks to all the super chats. Defund the oligarchy. Thanks to Left is Best. And Left is Best points out new leftist governments need to incorporate indigenous into the military, government, and police. Absolutely. Follow the Bolivia model with anti-imperialist military education. I couldn't agree more. So I know there was a great chat. There was a pretty big, fervent debate going on. I saw over 1,000 comments. So thanks to everyone who commented. This will be available as a podcast version over at Moderate Rebels if you want to listen to it. And we'll see you all next time.
Peace.
See ya.